Let's start with a simple but mind-blowing fact. Democracy, the idea that ordinary people have a say in their government, was once considered radical. It wasn't just uncommon, it was almost unthinkable. So how did it emerge? Why did it catch on? And how has it managed to become the dominant political system in so many parts of the world? To figure that out, we need to rewind to ancient Athens in the 5th century BCE. It's often called the birthplace of democracy, but it looked nothing like what we think of today. Athenian democracy wasn't about universal suffrage or inclusive participation. It was a system where only free adult males, about 10 to 20% of the population, could vote. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded entirely. So, right away, it's clear that democracy didn't start as a perfect system. It started as an experiment. But here's what made it revolutionary. For the first time in recorded history, ordinary citizens were given the power to make decisions about their city's future. They gathered in assemblies, debated issues, and voted on everything from laws to military strategy. It was messy, inefficient, and full of conflict, but it worked. For over a century, Athens thrived, becoming a hub of culture, philosophy, and innovation. Democracy wasn't just a political system, it was a way of life. Of course, Athens wasn't the only place experimenting with democracy. Around the same time, other cultures were exploring systems of shared governance. Indigenous communities in the Americas had long-standing traditions of collective decision-making. In ancient India, republic-like assemblies played a role in governance. Democracy wasn't a one-off invention, it was an idea that kept popping up wherever people sought a fairer way to distribute power.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
But here's the twist: democracy didn't last in Athens. It was overthrown by internal conflict and external pressures, replaced by oligarchies and empires. For centuries, the idea of democracy lay dormant. The Roman Republic kept some elements of shared governance, but even it eventually gave way to dictatorship. By the time the Middle Ages rolled around, monarchy was the default. Power was concentrated in the hands of kings, queens, and emperors, with little room for the voice of the people. So how did democracy come back? Fast forward to the Enlightenment, a period of intellectual awakening in the 17th and 18th centuries. Philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau began to argue that power should come from the consent of the governed. They weren't pulling this idea out of thin air. They were looking at historical examples, from Athens to the Magna Carta, and asking, what if we tried this again, but better? The American Revolution was one of the first major attempts to put these ideas into practice. The founders of the United States didn't create a perfect democracy. Women, enslaved people, and non-landowners were excluded, but they created a system that emphasized the rule of law, checks and balances, and representation. Around the same time, the French Revolution took the concept even further, challenging the idea of monarchy altogether. Democracy spread, but it wasn't smooth sailing. The 19th and 20th centuries were marked by fierce debates about who should get to participate. Should women vote? What about people of color? How do we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility? Every time democracy expanded, it faced resistance. But each struggle for inclusion, from abolition to civil rights to suffrage, made democracy more robust. By the end of World War II, democracy was on its way to becoming the global gold standard. Countries around the world looked to democratic governance as a way to rebuild and stabilize. But even as democracy gained ground, it faced new challenges: corruption, polarization, and inequality. which raises the question, has democracy reached its limits? Or is it just going through growing pains? Let's get real, democracy has never been perfect. From its earliest days, it's been a messy, often frustrating experiment. But for a long time, it felt like the best idea humanity had come up with. So why does it seem like democracy is struggling today? Why do so many people feel disillusioned with a system that's supposed to represent their voices and protect their freedoms? First, let's talk about trust. Democracy runs on it. You trust that your vote matters, that your leaders are acting in good faith, and that the system itself is designed to be fair. But what happens when that trust erodes? When people believe elections are rigged, politicians are corrupt, or the system is stacked against them? We're seeing this play out around the world, and it's one of the biggest threats to democracy today. Take voter turnout. In many democracies, it's shockingly low. Why? Because a lot of people feel like their votes don't change anything. They see politicians making promises they don't keep, or they feel like the system only works for the wealthy and powerful. This disconnection creates apathy, and apathy is democracy's kryptonite. A system built on participation can't survive if people stop participating. Then there's the issue of polarization. Democracy thrives on debate, on the idea that different viewpoints can come together to find common ground. But what happens when those viewpoints become so extreme, so hostile, that no one's willing to compromise? In many countries, politics has turned into a zero-sum game, where winning matters more than governing. This gridlock makes it harder for democracies to solve real problems, like climate change, economic inequality, or healthcare. Let's not forget about the role of technology. Social media was supposed to make democracy stronger by giving everyone a voice. Instead, it's created echo chambers where people only hear opinions that reinforce their own beliefs. Worse, it's become a tool for spreading misinformation and undermining trust in institutions. When people can't even agree on basic facts, how can they have meaningful debates about the future? But the challenges don't stop there. Democracy also struggles with inequality. In theory, every vote is supposed to carry the same weight, but in practice, wealth and power often tilt the scales. Campaigns cost money, and donors with deep pockets have a disproportionate influence on policy. Meanwhile, marginalized communities, those who need democracy the most, are often the ones who feel the most excluded from it. And then there's the rise of authoritarianism. Around the world, we're seeing leaders who claim to support democracy while eroding its foundations. They attack the press, undermine free elections, and concentrate power in their own hands. What's alarming is how often these leaders come to power through democratic means. They exploit the system's weaknesses to dismantle it from within. This raises a tough question: is democracy inherently fragile? Does it contain the seeds of its own destruction? Or are these challenges just growing pains, signs that democracy is evolving, not failing? Here's another thing to think about: what does working actually mean in a democracy? Is it about efficiency, representation, stability, justice? Sometimes these goals conflict. A system designed to give everyone a voice can feel slow and inefficient. A system focused on stability might overlook urgent social issues. Figuring out the right balance is one of democracy's biggest challenges. Let's not ignore the positives, though. Even in the face of these challenges, democracy has shown incredible resilience. Grassroots movements, activist groups, and ordinary citizens have stepped up to defend democratic principles. People have taken to the streets, run for office, and used their voices to push for change. Democracy may stumble, but it has a way of correcting itself if people stay engaged. Let's talk about the future. Democracy has survived wars, revolutions, and massive societal changes. But the challenges it faces today are unlike anything we've seen before. If democracy is going to stay relevant and even thrive, it has to evolve. The question is, how do we make it work better for everyone, not just the privileged few? First, let's address representation. One of the biggest criticisms of modern democracy is that it often feels disconnected from the people it's supposed to represent. Politicians seem out of touch, elections feel like a choice between bad options, and marginalized communities struggle to have their voices heard. If democracy is going to adapt, it needs to find ways to be more inclusive and representative of all its citizens. One idea is participatory democracy, where people don't just vote every few years, they're involved in decisions at every level. Think about citizens' assemblies or community councils, where ordinary people can directly influence policies that affect their lives. These systems have been tested in places like Ireland, where citizens' assemblies played a major role in shaping groundbreaking policies on same-sex marriage and abortion. It's not perfect, but it shows that giving people a real voice in decision-making can lead to meaningful change. Another solution is technology. Yes, technology has created problems for democracy, but it can also be part of the solution. Imagine online platforms where people can vote on local issues, participate in debates, or propose ideas for their communities. Technology can make democracy more accessible if it's done right. The key is ensuring these systems are secure, inclusive, and free from manipulation. Then there's the question of accountability. One reason people lose faith in democracy is that it often feels like leaders can get away with anything. Corruption, broken promises, and abuse of power erode trust in the system. Fixing this requires stronger checks and balances, independent courts, free press, and watchdog organizations that hold leaders accountable. But it also requires a cultural shift, where transparency and integrity are valued more than power and profit. Let's also talk about inequality. Democracy was built on the idea of equality, but in practice, economic disparities undermine that principle. Wealthy individuals and corporations wield disproportionate influence, while struggling communities are left behind. If democracy is going to survive, it has to address this imbalance. Policies like campaign finance reform, progressive taxation, and universal access to education and healthcare can level the playing field, giving everyone an equal chance to participate. And then there's the global perspective. Democracy isn't just a national issue, it's a global one. In an interconnected world, the challenges we face, climate change, pandemics, economic instability, require cooperation across borders. But how do you reconcile democratic principles with global governance? How do you ensure that people in one country don't feel like decisions are being made by distant, unaccountable institutions? These are tough questions, but they're essential if democracy is going to adapt to the realities of the 21st century. But here's the thing, democracy isn't just about systems and policies. It's about culture. It's about how people engage with each other, how they handle disagreements, and how they work together to solve problems. A healthy democracy requires citizens who are informed, empathetic, and willing to participate. That means investing in education, not just in academics, but in critical thinking, media literacy, and civic engagement. So where does all of this leave us? It leaves us with a choice. Democracy isn't something we inherit, it's something we build, maintain, and improve. It's messy, frustrating, and sometimes disappointing. But it's also one of the most powerful tools humanity has for creating a just and equitable society. The question is, are we willing to do the work? Let's end with this: democracy has always been an experiment. It's not a finished product, and it never will be. Its success depends on the people who believe in it, fight for it, and push it to be better. So the real question isn't whether democracy still works, it's whether we're willing to make it work. And that's a challenge worth taking on.